this is a topic that I am very passionate about because I think it is really, really important to think about as it, is involved in our economic system, our legal system, our social systems, class, all of those different intersections. Settler colonialism, I think, is an integral part to understanding all of them. I also think that settler colonialism goes hand in hand with racial capitalism, or the fungibilization of assimilated them. So this could be in ways like forcing them to use the English language instead of their native language, or forcing them to pray using Christianity instead of their own religion. All of these things are just erasing their memories of what their ancestors did, or even what, like, even as recent as their parents did, because it assimilates them into Western society. And then, like the one drop rule, where, even if you are someone that has an almost completely white heritage, if you have one drop of typically black blood in you, but also, like, it applies to indigenous or, like, any non-white identity in your blood, then, you are seen as a part of that class or as a subclass of white. So, the point of residential schools and assimilation is that that identity or that race is bred out of that person, their entire bloodline. So it just doesn't exist anymore because it is assimilated into whiteness. Because, they're incentivized to only make children with white people. So that results in the complete elimination of those biological and traditional cultural characteristics. They also say practices like the extraction of natural resources through mining pipelines and more. So colonialism is enacted in many different ways. So there's control over native land and the constant desire to expand at the expense of those peoples is enacted through extraction of natural resources. So thinking like Pipeline 3 that was going to go through the, what was it called? What reservation was that? Pine Ridge, maybe? No, that's not right. just